We turn now to John Locke and the revolution in knowledge. Although John Locke's epistemology, his theory of knowledge, is generally not highly thought of by 20th century philosophers, he approaches certain questions too casually for them. His role in intellectual history, the actual history of lived human thought in our culture, is almost incalculable in its importance. The epistemology of John Locke triumphs in the West. For 100 years, it will be John Locke whose epistemological authority and influence shapes the way that Europeans think about knowledge, its nature, and its acquisition, and think about the crucial importance of having epistemological authority. The way one thinks about the nature of knowledge, the standards of knowledge, the acquisition of knowledge, that sets the foundation and framework of one's thinking about all areas of human thought and inquiry. And it will be John Locke who sets that foundation for the 18th century. In the textbooks, John Locke often is used in sharp contrast to René Descartes in an attempt to draw a distinction between Descartes' rationalism on the one hand and Locke's empiricism on the other. This distinction has generally been overdrawn. For example, while Descartes founds his philosophy by purely rational means, rationalism independent of empirical inquiry, he reaches a point where one must become an empiricist and study the physical and physiological world and look scientifically, empirically, for the mechanisms of the natural order. And there is much that is empirical in Cartesian philosophy. Similarly, when Locke thinks about what makes something true and certain, he is a rationalist. Certainty does not apply to many kinds of propositions for Locke, but it does apply to propositions of relationship. Thus, for John Locke, we know that 3 is more than 2, that black is not white, that a circle is not a triangle. Not by our study of nature, by what he calls a bright sunshine of the mind. Those propositions are self-evident, that 3 is more than 2, the moment that the mind looks at them. So when Locke thinks about certainty, he is a rationalist in his criterion. So what then are the real debates between Descartes and Locke that lead to that formula of Locke the empiricist against Cartesian rationalism? Their real debates concern 2 issues above all. First, the goal of fundamental natural philosophy, and secondly, the issue of the source of ideas and what follows from identifying the source of our ideas. For Descartes, the goal of fundamental natural philosophy is truth about the real qualities of the world, knowing what the world really is as being. For John Locke, that knowledge is not obtainable, and the goal of fundamental natural philosophy is ordered, probable knowledge about our experience of the world, making sense of our experience of phenomena. For Descartes, the source of our ideas is innate. We have, before experience, an idea of self, of soul, of matter, of God, of the fundamental nature of being in the world. For John Locke, all of our ideas are acquired by experience. So for Locke, if the issue is where do we find certain, rational truth, his criterion is intuitive certainty, much in the manner of Descartes. But the real goal of knowledge is knowledge of our experience of the world, and that is known only by acquired ideas. So, for John Locke, natural philosophy is centered upon our experience of the world. And all of our ideas are acquired from two kinds of experience. First, sensation, the ideas imprinted upon our mind, acquired by our mind from our senses, and the senses' experience of the world. And secondly, what Locke terms reflection, the mind's experience of its own operations dealing with sensation. For example, to understand reflection, it is through sensation that I get an idea of trees. And my mind compares those trees, makes a judgment about which is taller. And I now have not only the experience of trees, I have the experience of comparing, the experience of judging. And those are the only two sources of our ideas, sensation and reflection. Simple sensations or reflections for Locke combine to form complex ideas. The best model for understanding what Locke means by complex ideas is drawn from atomism, the classical philosophy on which we already have spoken in this series. In the 17th century, a French philosopher by the name of Pierre Gassendi sought to revive classical atomism, the philosophy of Epicurus. And Locke read him with great interest. And in the physics of atomism, the complex beings of the world are formed by the combinations of simple atoms. Different atoms formed together, creating what we now would think of as a molecule formed of simple atoms. This is Locke's model for the creation of complex ideas. The mind takes simple sensations, simple reflections, and combines these into complex ideas so that I may get from reason, willing, body of a certain kind, to my idea of a human being, to my idea of a society. The mind combines simple ideas into complex ideas. But what Locke is certain of is that there are no innate ideas, and thus all of our knowledge is limited to our experience of the world. There is no knowledge beyond human experience because all ideas and hence all knowledge are acquired only by our experience of the world. What follows from that is that we can have no knowledge of what underlies experience. It's not that there's nothing that underlies experience. It's that we obviously can't know what that is, because as we are created, as our minds work, we are limited in our knowledge to what we experience. Here is where the contrast between Locke and Descartes becomes most influential and indeed dramatic. If we can have no knowledge of what underlies experience, it means we can have no rational knowledge of what mind is. We only know our experience of the behavior of mind. We can have no knowledge of what matter is. We only can have experience of the behavior of matter. What Locke is saying is nothing less than that ontology, the science of being, the philosophy of being, the real nature of the world, is beyond the powers of the human mind. Locke argues that what we do in our experience and knowledge of mind and matter is we take what seems to us the most striking aspect of that experience, that mind thinks, that matter is extended in length, width, breadth in space, that matter is ultimately impenetrable, and we give the name of what matter is to those qualities, the name of what mind is to those qualities. That when we say mind is thought, matter is extension, we have no ontological knowledge there. We're sticking a flag, in effect, in a dramatic part of our experience of mind and matter, and saying, I'll identify mind that way. I'll identify matter that way. In short, he argues, to use his terms, we know the nominal essence of matter, what we name, not the real essence of matter, what it actually is in its being. We know the nominal, not the real essence of mind. For Locke, this admission of ontological incapacity is proper humility. God could have created us capable of knowing anything that he chose us to know. He created us, we discover by the study of our own minds, not capable of knowing the real essence of things, and limited to knowledge of experience. And it is proper humility to recognize the limitations of human nature, of human thought, of human knowledge. On the issue of Cartesian dualism, the relationship of matter and thought, there is much evidence in Locke's writings that he leans informally toward dualism, that we are made of two seemingly incompatible entities, matter and mind. But we have absolutely no knowledge of that dualism, and if anyone is to accuse him of irreligion, saying that we do not know that we have a soul distinct from a material body, we don't know the nature of soul, we don't know the nature of body, Locke turns the question of irreligiosity back upon his critics. He's saying, for a human being to argue that we know with certainty that we must be made of two distinct beings, That is for a human being to say that God himself, had he chosen, in his omnipotence, is incapable of creating matter that is capable of thought. That God would have lacked the power, if he had so chosen, to create matter capable of thought. That is the arrogance, an ontological claim that would bind God. Humility is understanding the limitations of human knowledge, and we need to admit ignorance. The proper response to questions that go beyond human experience of the world and our ability to answer questions based on experience is, I don't know. We cannot answer that question. That is beyond human knowledge. And Locke believes, and the 18th century will believe, that Western philosophy needs to admit ignorance far, far more than it ever had done. We need to abate the claims of philosophy. The Lockean agenda, then, is not to speculate fruitlessly on what mind is, but to learn in and from experience how mind behaves. The question is not to speculate endlessly on what matter is, about which philosophers never could agree because they have no knowledge on which to base agreement or disagreement, but to learn from and in experience how the world of physical objects behaves. And since such knowledge is not based on logic, but on experience, it is always open to correction by further experience. That's one of the things that follows from saying that knowledge is bound by experience, that it always can be corrected by further experience. Think of someone from the tropics who hears the claim that water can become so hard that someone can walk across a river or walk across a lake. The person says, that's never occurred in my experience. That's true. But if the person should infer from that, therefore it can't happen, what will occur? The first time the person encounters ice, a frozen lake, a frozen pond in a different climate, then he must modify his views about water and what is and is not possible based upon experience. And we're always in that situation. We are always theoretically the person from the tropics who never has experienced water in that frozen state. So knowledge is always open to emendation, to correction, based upon new experience. Locke's epistemology will become the dominant theory of knowledge of the 18th century, affecting a vast revolution in the culture's sense of the nature and limits of natural knowing. What are the essential qualities of this Lockean model? First, that the mind is, in his phrase, a tabula rasa, a blank slate on which nature imprints ideas via sensations, and in which mind becomes aware of its own operations and powers as it deals with sensations via reflection. And that while in Lockean philosophy some ideas seem naturally to attract each other by association, the mind in the creation of knowledge is above all else active. And by abstraction and combination, it forms complex ideas. And finally, that propositions about the world, since they are based upon experience, may only be probable and depend for their probability upon their relationship to prior experience, and are always subject to change by future experience. The influence of this model is such a vital cultural force in the 18th century. It leads to a demand for analysis, for clarity, for confirmation of claims. In theory, any proposition, the most complex, the most abstract, any claim about the nature of things may be analyzed into its component ideas and then into its component experiences, and may be judged in relationship to our actual experience of the world. The world of real knowledge becomes, by analysis and by experimental confirmation, a lucid world, an accessible and unmystifying world, devoid of obscurity. People make claims, and you have the right to say, how do you know that? Based upon what experiences? Based upon what tests? Take what was complex, analyze it into its simple parts and claims, and confirm or disconfirm propositions about the world by comparing them to the actual behavior of the things described. That becomes, in many ways, the mission of the 18th century. Locke is not writing something wholly new under the sun, and one should understand something about the roots and the implications of Locke's model. His distinction between nominal and real essence harken back to the deepest medieval debates between nominalism and realism, and the state of possible human ontological knowledge, knowledge about being. Locke is the great nominalist of the 17th and 18th centuries. Locke's sense of the method of knowledge based upon induction is deeply linked to Bacon and to Bacon's whole model of inquiry in the New Organon. Locke's sense of names that we give the objects of our experience, that we put these flags of names to keep our memory of parts of experience alive. This is a theory of language with roots in the work of Thomas Hobbes, and Locke has read, is aware of, and often acknowledges many of these debates. The implications of Locke perplex many in the 18th century. And there are a significant number of thinkers who try to mechanize Locke's model of mind, to make it consistent with the growing mechanism of early modern thought. Thus, one French Lockean, Claude Adrien Helvetius, an influential French philosopher of the second half of the 18th century, believing that he is teaching Lockean philosophy, will argue that to sense, to have a sensation, is to judge, because there is an automatic process that leads us from our sensory experience of the world to our knowledge of the world. But as Helvetius's great critic Rousseau will see very clearly, this distorts Locke utterly, because Locke has insisted as a central aspect of his philosophy that the human mind is active. It is an active agency that wills, that chooses, that compares, that judges. But these different readings of Locke will lead to great debates about the implications of Locke for materialism, for mechanism, for whether we can have a physiology of thought. A second implication of Locke that will obsess so many 18th century thinkers is that we learn ethical ideas by experience, also implying that our ethical notions are wholly relative to our experience. As Locke analyzes the acquisition of ethical ideas, he argues that we call good those things that cause or that we believe will cause our well-being. We call evil those things that cause or that we believe will cause pain. This model sounds terribly subversive of any sense of absolute ethics, and indeed sounds very close to Thomas Hobbes's model of the nature of ethical thinking. What saves Locke in the minds of the culture from being categorized with Hobbes as an ethical relativist who sees nothing beyond pain and pleasure as the source of good and evil? It is in Locke that the model is providential, that human nature is created by God and adapted to our real needs by God, such that in Locke's model, God providentially has joined the good to the real causes of human well-being and happiness. God has joined evil to the real causes of human suffering and pain. When we study societies, or indeed our own lives, we discover that the things that yield real happiness are things such as friendship, family, neighborliness, being members of a good society, living at peace with our fellow creatures. The system is providential, but its implications indeed are dramatic, that all we mean by good are those things that we associate with our well-being. The implications of this Lockean system are very dramatic. If our knowledge of ethics and the world is determined by our particular experience, then it would seem that environment determines all. Change the environment. Change what causes pain and pleasure, reward and punishment in a society. And you change the very thinking and ethical nature of the individuals within it. The implications seem dramatic in terms of relativism, that what we think, what we believe, what we value is relative to the time, place, and circumstance of our experience. The implication is also very dramatic that character is not something, as the West so long had thought, fixed and essential, but something that is developed by experience. If one looks at medieval and Renaissance drama, you have the clash of fixed essential types, saint and sinner, hero and coward. If you look at Western drama and the Western novel from the influence of Locke on, what do we see? We see the development of character, what in someone's life led to what someone is. Locke also bequeaths a terrible specter for the future of 18th century and indeed all further Western philosophy, the specter of what is called philosophical idealism. If all we really know are our ideas of the world, how do we know if there is anything real that corresponds to them, that resembles them out there? All we seem to know are internal impressions and ideas. And finally, Locke raises the dramatic question in his epistemology: how do we base religious belief upon empirical knowledge? And in his own work of Christian apologetics, The Reasonableness of Christianity, he recognizes that we need empirical evidence of Christian truth and points to the miracles of Christ and the fulfillment of prophecy based upon valid testimony as evidence that that revelation could only come from God. And that places the issue of the empirical foundations of Christianity central to the debates of the 18th century. Thank you very much.